today's episode, we're diving into the basics of special needs trusts. I'm so excited to introduce to you my colleague, Ellen Cookman. Ellen is the principal attorney at Cookman Law in Palo Alto, California. She is passionate about helping families of all shapes and sizes plan for the future and utilize available resources. Ellen is a certified specialist in estate planning, trust, and probate law from the California State Bar, and she also shares her knowledge through her popular YouTube channel titled Ellen Cookman Special Needs Trust Attorney, where she provides invaluable insights on navigating the complexities of estate planning and special needs trusts. I encourage you to check out her YouTube channel. You will see from this conversation that Ellen not only has a true passion for estate planning, but also a talent for teaching. Ellen will help us understand the basics of special needs trusts and how this can play a vital role in crafting a legacy that ensures the care and support for loved ones with special needs. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as we did. Ellen Cookman, welcome to the Legacy of Love podcast. I'm so happy you're here.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, so before we dive into all things special needs trust, I would love to just start off so that listeners know why you do this work, what brought you to this work and the world of estate planning and special needs trusts.
Oh, you bet. You bet. Well, I think initially I was inspired to be a lawyer by my dad, who did civil rights work and really helped to desegregate, different governmental entities, which was super cool. And so I thought, okay, maybe I'll do this, for women's rights work. And then I figured, well, women seem to be doing pretty well. There's still some ways to go. But then I was volunteering in some different disability groups, and then I also was teaching. I back up a little bit. I worked for 3 years at a big law firm because that's what people tend to do after law school. And, the people were really nice there and I was paying off my loans, but everything else about it I hated. I was doing litigation and I am not a fighter. Yeah, so I burned out and I went to teach at a small private school that does full inclusion of typical and special needs. My roommate at the
Oh,
time, I was single, my roommate was teaching there in kindergarten, and she said, Ellen, they're starting up a high school learning center and they're also looking for somebody to teach middle school math. And I was like, well, I guess I can do that. And I kind of feel like, my family is a family of lawyers and teachers. And when I don't know what I want to do with life, I teach. So I went to teach there for
oh,
a year.
yeah.
Yeah. And while I was teaching there was a parent support group meeting where an attorney came to talk about special needs planning. And it really piqued my interest. So I attended because I was like, what am I going to do with this law degree? I know I don't want to do litigation. I have no idea what I'm going to do with it. So I attended her presentation and I was like, oh, you can work with families and actually talk with them about what matters instead of just being stuck behind a computer doing discovery requests and research all day, right? And she was 8 months pregnant with her third kid. And I was like,
Oh,
oh, you can raise a family doing this. That sounds great. And then I walked with her out to her car and she was driving this black BMW. I was like, oh, you can make money doing this and support a family. That sounds even better. So I looked into the field and decided, this could really be a great match. And so I ended up working at two different firms for 6 years, doing estate planning and specializing in special needs planning. And, neither firm was really the right fit for me. So then I tried going on my own, and that was 2015. So that's been 9 years, and I've been
um,
practicing in the field ever since. And I love it.
oh, that's wonderful. It's funny we've known each other long enough now, but I didn't know that you had that kind of background also in teaching, where
Yeah.
that's where I think so much of why I love you is I feel like yes, you're an amazing attorney, but you also have a heart of a teacher.
Mhm.
And I think that's also makes sense where like your YouTube channel is just so helpful and practical. I think, in the world of estate planning, it can be intimidating for people. People don't understand it. They don't know where to start. Maybe they think it's too expensive. And so what you're doing, I think is just so helpful because it's a nice, place for people to go to have a better understanding of maybe, those initial steps and makes it less intimidating and more digestible. So anyways, thank you for sharing your personal story.
Oh, of course. And just to let you know how the YouTube channel started, it's actually funny because in estate planning and special needs planning, everybody's different. Like every family is different, but we see a lot of themes come up, a lot of things
Yeah.
that, that are frequently happen. There's nothing new under the sun, right? So at one point I was just like, wow, this week I have explained the same concept 3 times. Wouldn't it be nice if I could just press play and and save my
Yeah.
vocal cords a little bit? And also when I, hang up with a client, a lot of times like 3/4 of the information that I share just kind of goes, it's just impossible to keep all of that. So I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could just have a recording of this? And then it was like, oh, that's what YouTube is. Hey, so I really started it, to help my clients to retain a lot of what we had already talked about, and also to save my vocal cords a little bit. And I feel like it's kind of, it's expanded from there.
Oh, yeah, and that very much resonates. Similar. I mean, people come to me asking different questions, but I think when, especially clients in the planning phase, that's where I do feel I'm repeating myself a lot. And what I actually find is when people, are booking consults with me, families with, a disabled child and the special needs trust planning, so many people are only thinking at death, but, the incapacity piece is still kind of
That's
not
right.
front of mind. Anyways, that's kind of a drum that I'm just continuing to beat. So hopefully this podcast kind of helps, encourage people to think kind of through all the possibilities and scenarios as we plan a legacy. That's very much part of the piece. It's not just after death. It's, you know,
It's now. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
it's
Because we don't
no.
know what's going to happen when we step out of our house, right?
Right. I
Yeah.
know.
And one thing I realized I didn't add when I was kind of sharing my story is I went into this field into special needs planning, but then my older son, when he was 4, he was diagnosed with high functioning autism. So I went from being an advocate in the community to being a parent and understanding
Wow.
so much more what parents go through. We did pivotal response therapy, which was awesome for him, but schlepping him to and fro the different things, trying to get him potty trained when his peers were already there. Like there are just a lot of
Wow.
things. And he's doing awesome now. He's in a great school. He's actually in the school that I was teaching at for a year.
Oh, the synchronicity.
Yeah, yeah, Hope Technology School, which they're just awesome. So wow, yeah, it was so interesting to then really understand the parent side of things.
Right. I
Yeah.
know. I don't know, at least for myself, because what comes to mind, what I deal with professionally and then knowing it personally is I don't know if it makes it easier. I don't know. Like I lost my grandmother. She had Alzheimer's. She had, I think, from diagnosis to death, it was around 8 years. And, supporting clients as they age, is very much part of my work. But, still kind of hand holding her through that was,
Right.
it didn't make it easier. But,
That's right.
anyways, I would love to kind of dive into what is a special needs trust.
Yeah, you bet. You bet. Okay, so the big issue when we have kids with disabilities is, when they grow up, then they can become eligible for certain public benefits. And this is usually when they turn 18, because at 18 they're, all of a sudden an adult, which is funny if you know
Yeah.
18-year-olds, right?
Yeah.
They're not,
Not at
maybe they're
all.
not adulting yet, but they're considered legally an adult. And so the parents' money is not attributable to the child. So now the child becomes poor and they can qualify for an income stream and for health insurance. And those are the two things, when you think about it, those are the two things that you get when you're working a job. You get a salary, which is your income stream, and you get health insurance. And I always like to point out that someday the US is going to figure out how to not connect health insurance with a job, but we're not there yet. So we deal with what we have, right?
Yeah.
Now, the problem is if a child receives an inheritance outright, or even in, a fairly permissive trust that maybe the child can become trustee of, or maybe the child is, entitled to discretionary distributions, or, mandatory distributions, then that counts as the child's money. And all of a sudden the child is not poor and they can't qualify for these certain public benefits, for SSI and Medi-Cal, though the Medi-Cal rules have changed a little bit, but they still look at the income. So we need to set up a certain type of trust called a special needs trust. And in that trust, basically what it says is that the child can't manage their own money. And because somebody else is managing it, because somebody else is acting as a trustee, which could be a private professional fiduciary like you, Sarah, right?
Yes.
Because somebody else is managing it, it doesn't count as the child's own money. Even though all of the money in there, it could be $1 million, it could be $10 million, it could be $200,000, right? All of that money is the child's money. It's meant to, pay for things that the child needs, but because the child can't access it or demand it or, change the trust, it doesn't count as the child's money for public benefits purposes. So you really get to have your cake and eat it too. You can have the safety net of money sitting there for the child for anything really. And it's very broad, by the way. A special needs trust can be used for just about anything. There was a recent court case that said, it's really intended for the child's welfare and happiness and increasing their quality of life, as opposed to just being used for, transportation and, buying a wheelchair and like things that are directly related to the special needs issues. So yeah, so you can have it for just about anything, but you can continue to receive your public benefits as well, which is super important, especially the healthcare side, right? If you can't get health insurance and you're in an emergency room, as we all know, for a week, that could be $500,000 blown, right?
Yeah.
So it's so important to, to be able to keep those benefits and have a safety net of money at the same time.
Oh, that's helpful. What I find, just kind of putting myself in parent shoes, with maybe a younger child, maybe you have a diagnosis, maybe you don't, but coming from it from a planning perspective, I could see that it can be, to me at least, it feels kind of overwhelming. Like there's
Yeah.
so many unknowns. Like at this point, just even thinking about you, obviously it helped that you were already an attorney and very much knew about this work. But when you're supporting your son and you're getting the diagnosis and he's 4 or 5 years old and you don't even know how he will grow and evolve and what
Right.
his support will be needed, and will he be able to work, will he need to be on public benefits? There's so many unknowns in that piece. Kind of, how do you support families in that? Does it make sense to establish a special needs trust? Is there flexibility there?
So I try to build in as much flexibility as possible in a special needs trust because there are a lot of families with kiddos, like my son, who's very high functioning, but because of maybe some social challenges or other things, he may not be able to hold down a full-time job, right? So, when we're looking at special needs planning, it's not just the special needs trust. We also have to, usually we create or we do a restatement and amendment of the parent's revocable trust as well, because it's in the revocable trust that says how does the child get their money? Okay. And in the revocable trust, you can actually put in kind of like a toggle switch. You say, hey, this family member is kind of in charge of finding out, whether Joey, the disabled child, whether he really needs a special needs trust in the future or not. And so this family member can make that determination, and Joey's inheritance can either toggle over to a special needs trust if he needs it, right? If he's receiving public benefits or if it looks like he needs to in the future, or it can toggle over to a more permissive trust, like a lifetime trust, or they're often called dynasty trusts. And that type of trust, Joey might be able to take over as trustee someday, as opposed to the special needs trust where Joey is, prohibited from acting as trustee. And then also in the special needs trust, I like putting in kind of an early termination provision where it says, if Joey is able to work and support himself for say 3 or 5 years and he gets health insurance because of that, then that special needs trust can basically be terminated and morphed into more like a dynasty trust or more permissive trust. So there's really 2 times where a special needs trust can more like become a less restrictive trust. But keep in mind, it's difficult to do it backwards. You can't really say, okay, now a dynasty trust can become a special needs trust. It's like a tube of toothpaste. You can only squeeze it out. You can't really push it back in, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Mhm.
That makes sense. Absolutely. Well, and I think it's also because obviously planning for the event that all of these agencies might audit, right? Like Social Security, for
Mhm.
example, I know that one of the important pieces there where you wouldn't want to jeopardize, let's just say SSI benefits because it's the most restrictive.
Mhm.
They would be definitely looking and making sure this was always a special needs trust and that
Right.
beneficiary never had full access to the money, meaning they're acting as trustee. So
That's right.
that
That's
makes
right.
sense. You can't really go back on that. So,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. We'll say it's not a good look, but yeah, no, legally there's also terms for that. And that's also one reason why when I'm creating a special needs trust, I just about always do what we call standalone special needs trust. It's a seed trust in that it's a trust that's created that stands on its own. It's not what we call a testamentary trust, which just springs into being upon somebody's death. You find testamentary trusts embedded within revocable trusts. A lot of times
mhm.
people set it up that way when they work with an attorney who doesn't specialize in special needs planning. And they have a little button in their drafting program that says, populate special needs trust. And they go, oh, I can do that. And but the problem with that, if you have a special needs trust within a revocable trust, is as you mentioned, when Social Security Administration looks at this trust when it's funded, they want to see the special needs trust. They don't know where the revocable trust ends and the special needs trust begins, and they get all confused because they're not trained to review trusts. And
Yeah.
sometimes they even ask you to cut and paste, to say, okay, where's the section that talks about trustees for special needs trust? Where's the section that talks about alternate distribution? They get really confused. So I like doing a standalone special needs trust that here's the special needs trust. It's funded with $10. So it's not up and running yet. You don't have to get your own tax ID number. You don't have to file tax returns yet. It's kind of it's waiting in the wings. It's waiting to be funded, but the structure
Mm.
is there. The successor trustee can review the terms, make sure that they're okay with it. And it's also available to be funded if somebody else wants to fund it. If there's a grandma or grandpa, I have a video that's
Mm.
called Thank You for the Gift, Rich Auntie. So a lot of times people have other family members who want to help support your disabled kid. But how do they do that? So if you have a standalone special needs trust, they can modify their own estate plan to say, hey, I want to leave $100,000 to Joey's special needs trust. And it can be funded regardless of whether you're still alive or not, because it's already up and running.
Oh, I love that. And that seems like it really would simplify things, especially in that kind of thinking about the family and,
Right.
aunt and, grandma and such. Oh,
Yeah.
that's wonderful. So when do you kind of advise to go that route, having a standalone special needs trust versus having what you called a testamentary trust
Uh-huh.
where it's
Uh-huh.
embedded in the family's revocable living trust?
Yeah, well, I think a testamentary trust is okay if you're not sure if it's going to be used or not. Like, for example, some people have elderly parents who are receiving Medi-Cal and maybe even SSI benefits, and they're supporting their elderly parents, but they're worried if they die, then nobody's going to be around to support the elderly parents, but they can't leave money to the parents because that'll mess up their benefits. So they can set up a special needs trust for their parent, but more likely than not, the parent will die before them, right? And so it may not make a lot of sense to set up a standalone special needs trust because, chances are it won't be funded, but it's there just in case. So I like having kind of the boots and suspenders just in case special needs trust to be embedded within the revocable trust. But if you're pretty sure it's going to be used, or if there's a high percentage chance that you'll need the special needs trust up and running at some point, then I do like doing a standalone one.
Oh, that helps. That helps. I didn't quite know that because I see both scenarios. So that's good to
Mm-hmm.
know from like a planner's perspective. That's kind of the distinction there, if it's more for sure.
Yeah, it's
So,
my distinction. I don't know how other people do it. I mean, it's so interesting because everybody drafts trusts different ways, right? And
yes.
sometimes I'm reading somebody else's trust and I'm like, I'm not quite sure what this is saying, And because there's no like rule of, a trust must start with this language and then it has to go to this language. And so there's a lot of flexibility in drafting trusts in general.
Well, I think that goes into kind of my next question because for me, I don't know if many people think this way, but I do doing this work. How can a family feel and know that they're kind of working with, a reputable estate planning attorney? And I think, specifically with special needs trusts, because you just use the example of, oh yeah, there are attorneys, maybe they'll say, oh, we can do a special needs trust, but it's really not their expertise.
Yeah.
And, I can say from my perspective, I see the difference definitely downstream,
Mhm.
decades later, once these special needs trusts are funded. And I see, trusts where things really were well drafted and all of those kind of pieces are in place. And then I've also unfortunately seen the other scenario
Yeah.
where things aren't clear, they're poorly drafted. It's very clear that this attorney didn't specialize in this area, and we're needing to either go to court to petition or all sorts of unfun, less ideal scenarios.
Yep, yep. Fun, not fun. Whenever
Yeah.
you go to court, not fun.
Not
Yeah.
fun. Yeah.
Well, Sarah, you said something so important in that we don't know when, like you don't find out whether your trust works until you're gone. And then it's too late. And I think you're right. That causes a lot of the families that I work with great anxiety because they are the only advocates for their kids and their kids can't advocate for themselves. So when you're choosing an attorney who, first you find out how many special needs trusts do you typically draft? Ask them, like find out if that is a specialty of theirs. And I also think and other people may disagree, but I also think it's really important to work with an attorney who also does the backside, who does trust administration. Because
Yeah,
when you
I
do the trust
agree.
administration, you see all the ways that it can go sideways. And I don't want to be slamming. I do have some friends who just do estate planning, and because doing the trust administration, when somebody dies, you have to actually take other steps. It's not like a magic wand that all of a sudden, presto, everything goes to your kids. Like there's a lot of steps that you go through and it can be really complicated. And you're dealing with banks and other financial institutions, and you really learn through trial and error what actually works and what doesn't work through this trust administration process. You see, okay, that's why that's written in the trust. Just because we're estate planning attorneys doesn't mean that all of a sudden we, understand every provision in the trust. So I think, working with someone who does the front end, the planning, and the back end, the administration, I think that's key. You can also look for testimonials, see, other families who have worked with the attorney and then they're gone. So maybe it would be a child of a parent who passed away and then a special needs trust was funded, and find out, did that work? How did that go? How smooth was that? It's so interesting because I talk with different clients and some of them are like, wow, we went through the trust admin process. It was so smooth. I loved it. That attorney did such a good job really setting things up for success. But unfortunately, more often I hear, oh my goodness, that was, the deepest pit of hell, right? That process, right? And they want it, they're coming to me to make sure that their kids don't go through the same process that they did when their parents passed away and there were a lot of things that were missed. So there are a lot of things that we do. I'd say that with estate planning is about a third drafting documents. The hard thing is that that's the result that most people see. They see, okay, I have this binder of documents that I don't really understand. That's what I'm paying for. But you're also paying for the red flags that go off in the attorney's mind to think, oh, we also have to look for this. We have to make sure that the trust is fully funded. So when the parents die, it passes through the terms of the trust. It doesn't get stuck in probate. You don't have to go to court, to modify things. I do a lot of petitions to modify trusts and to, they're called Hegstead petitions to actually put assets into the trust. So there's a lot of ways that things can go sideways.
Yeah, I think that that definitely helps, listeners know what to look for. And I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, even, from my perspective, as when I'm named like as successor trustee, for example, or as an alternate agent under the durable power of attorney, I always like to look at a draft of documents. And when an attorney that is only doing the drafts, I can see the difference
Mhm.
sometimes, not always, but
Mhm,
sometimes.
mhm.
Actually, a colleague reached out to me and she reviewed a trust that she was named in, and it was a smaller trust, like less than 500,000 in assets, and they had over 100 beneficiaries. And
Oh
yeah,
no.
yeah, and the language was like, also like, how could someone actually administer this? Like, one of the examples was even like, I have a jar in my house and those coins are going to be donated to this charity. Anyways, there's been numerous of examples like that where, I think for most people, you assume that your attorney is going to advise you well. And, once you check this off the box of things to do, you're covered, you're set, and everything will go according to plan. But I think there's so much that an estate planning attorney can do and should do. And what I'm finding is that a lot aren't having these
Mhm.
conversations, even though a client might be asking for this or wanting to do this. I think that that's where, educating them on the realities of, a
Yes.
trust administration is just such an important piece. And again, why I just love you and all the work that you do, and having your YouTube channel and just really informing people, like, these are so many pieces to think about, and obviously it can be overwhelming. So
Yeah. Sarah, one thing that I find funny when I have a lot of clients who come in and they go, well, I have a pretty simple situation, and they start describing it. And then sometimes I have to go, okay, now let me list off these 3 or 5 things. This is what makes your situation not simple, right? And they're surprised. They're like, oh, I thought it was just really straightforward. And it's like, and yet,
and
these
yeah,
are the things that can really derail your plan and really cause headaches and hassles for the next generation. So a lot of what we do is issue spotting. And when somebody says, I
yeah,
want 1% off the top to go to a charity, I'm like, oh my goodness, you have just made the trust administration process 1 year longer, because now you have to
yeah,
get a full accounting of the entire thing, because the charity wants to make sure that they get their full 1%.
1%,
Right. And
yes.
and they don't realize, oh, I thought I was just doing a good deed, a mitzvah to this charity. It's like, no, there's other ways we can set this up.
There's other
Right.
ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. X amount is always nice
Yes,
there.
exactly.
Well, another question here for families that maybe their child isn't disabled. So I think in this scenario, who I'm thinking of is probably a teenager or even an adult child. There's not a formal disability or diagnosis, but this child is clearly either not working at all or has been unable to have a steady job. Maybe I could see like some sort of like alcohol or substance abuse.
Mhm.
In those scenarios, would you say that special needs trust could work, or do you have to have a disability in order to have a special needs trust? I guess that's my question.
Right. Well, so it depends on the type of special needs trust. For a third party special needs trust, which is really what we've been talking about, where you're setting up a trust for somebody else and you're funding it for somebody else, you are the third party funding the disabled person's trust. The beneficiary of a third party special needs trust doesn't need to be qualified as disabled. However, it may not make sense to set up a special needs trust in that situation for somebody. I like saying, they haven't quite flown the coop. They
Yeah,
still need a bit of scaffolding. Most likely they won't be able to be fully independent. And if they receive their inheritance outright, or if they're able to manage their inheritance, they could blow right through it. They could kill themselves, with buying drugs, right? Like, it can get really serious. So for those situations, I usually suggest a lifetime trust where somebody else can manage it. The special needs trust is really important in that, somebody can qualify for public benefits. But I think that a lifetime trust works just as well when you're not dealing with public benefits. You just make sure that somebody else is the trustee so that the kid can't mess things up, that they're still working with somebody else as the trustee, but it doesn't necessarily have to have that stigma behind it, of calling it a special needs trust or something. If there's any chance though that child in the future might need public benefits, then you really should start with a special needs trust. And you don't have to call it a special needs trust. I often call it a supplemental trust,
Yes.
so, but then you have the special needs language inside the trust, but then the kid doesn't feel like they're being treated differently, especially if there's, or I've even called a lifetime trust. I have a video called Planning for Kids of Differing Abilities. And that's when you have a neurotypical child and a special needs child, kind of like I do. And you can call all of them lifetime trusts. It doesn't really matter what you call the special needs trust, as long as the language and the trust is accurate. However,
That
it really
makes
helps to
sense.
call it a special needs trust if you know that Social Security Administration is going to be reviewing it, because they might be like, well, why didn't you call this a special needs trust? Is there something different about it? And that raises their red flags, So again, we do have the flexibility. Now, when you're dealing with a first party special needs trust, so that's somebody inherited their own money or received it through a litigation settlement, they're putting their own money into a special needs trust. That's a first party special needs trust. It's the source of the funds, right? So they are the first party and they're putting their own money in. For a first party special needs trust, they must qualify as disabled. In
That
that
makes sense.
case, yeah. So if you have somebody who is not fully functioning in the world and they need some extra protection, they can actually set up their own revocable trust and then name somebody else as trustee. So you still have the protections of, that other person managing the money and making sure that they don't blow it.
That absolutely makes sense. Otherwise, I guess if you didn't have to have a disability with a first party special needs trust, everyone would be establishing them and getting on public benefits. Right.
Could be.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. That helps. Yeah, I appreciate what you said because that definitely makes the distinction where with third party special needs trusts where you don't have to necessarily have that disability, but it's the public benefits piece is really what is essential to kind of to know or at least plan for or discuss.
That's right.
Again, I think that's one of the challenges with planning, especially if your children are younger, there's a
Mhm.
lot of unknowns. So usually what I hear is, probably plan for every 3 to 5 years. You should at least have a check-in with your estate planning attorney.
Yes, yes. I meant to mention that actually. I do encourage my clients at least every 3 to 5 years to come in. We can talk about what's changed, how's your kid developing. I've actually had several situations where, like, we had a kid, one with epilepsy, and it was pretty debilitating. And then she was able to get on the right meds and it was getting better. And now she's teaching preschool, and
Oh,
we
wonderful.
changed their estate plan from special needs trust for her to a lifetime trust that she can manage herself. So we do have some of those, graduation, very happy stories. So it does happen,
Oh, that's nice to know. I guess
isn't
from your
it?
side, you see that from my side, because if someone needs a professional fiduciary, I don't get to hear those stories,
Yeah.
unfortunately, you know.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like, Sarah, you and I are in the same boat in that folks usually don't come to see us when everything's hunky dory. It's all
Yeah.
sunshine and rainbows. Usually, like folks come to me. I mean, I love helping, families with 2.5 kids and a dog and,
Yeah.
yeah, but usually people come to our firm when things have gone a little bit sideways and their kids haven't, or at least one of them hasn't turned out exactly the way they were hoping. And
Yeah.
and usually it's when the kids are a little bit older that they've kind of come to terms with that, right? That, okay, I don't think my kid's ever going to really be able to work and support themselves. Now it's time. Now I love it when they come in earlier, like what you're describing, and they realize, okay, my kid was just had a diagnosis, or, my kid has Down syndrome. We need to plan for the future. But a lot of times families in that situation, they are so busy with the IEPs, with
I know.
driving their kids around to different therapies, just like I was with Caleb. Oh, and I need to give my husband a lot of credit for that, by the way. He's a special ed teacher by trade.
Oh,
And
wow.
so he did
Love
all the
that.
pivotal response therapy stuff. when he was talking to the psychologist about it, it was like they were talking a different language. It was so crazy. I would just step back and be like, well, you guys can deal with this. I don't know what you're talking about.
Wow.
Right?
That's
So I'm so
insane.
lucky. And now he's a stay-at-home
Yes.
dad and I'm
Oh,
I'm working and I love it. I always wanted a house husband growing up. It's funny. I love working. I love all that. And yet I knew if I had, a husband who was also like jet setting around the country and stuff, then, balls would be dropped. And it's so great that and my boys just love having him at home. So, I feel like you figure out what works for your family. Every family is
yeah.
different and you can't really
Yeah.
compare yourself to the Joneses, right?
No. And I think that's probably so much now more so. Like families are changing, right? I mean, divorce rates are what, 50%? I don't know if they're on the rise, but they've been consistently that way. And, my thought is the more that we're having divorce, the more that people are getting remarried a second, third time, having blended families, having children, in the first marriage, then also in the second, all of these kind of scenarios just really kind of add a level of complexity. And when really thinking about your legacy, and I think especially after death, I think enough of us have heard those horror stories where families fall apart, you know.
Yes. Oh yeah, it's so hard. Yeah. Yeah, I know our boys, they have 7 grandparents because
Wow.
yeah, I know, right? Because my parents and Scott's parents both got divorced and most of them got remarried. And we also have a, bonus great aunt who's kind of like a grandma, right? So there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, which we love. Most of our vacations are going to visit the different grandparents, which
Yeah.
which is okay. But
All of
it
them.
does it does add complexity. I have videos on estate planning for blended families, and unfortunately, the divorce rate, as you know, in the special needs community is very high. And personally, when we were going through Caleb's diagnosis process, I had several friends who were in early childhood education, and I feel like they really risked their friendship with me by really speaking up and saying, hey, you might want to get Caleb tested. And I was just thinking, oh, he's a little bit eccentric and, he likes lining up shoes and he's curious about light switches and right, kind of that's okay. Maybe he'll be an engineer, whatever. And that's what my husband was saying too. But I would mention to him, hey, so and so friend had mentioned maybe we should get him tested. And Scott was like, oh no, he's fine. Because Scott worked, as I mentioned, as a special ed teacher, but he worked with kids with learning disabilities and behavioral challenges. And
Oh,
Caleb
so it
doesn't
looked
have
very
either of those. He's
different.
super bright and
Yeah.
he's very compliant and friendly. And so he really resisted Caleb being tested. But finally, my mom started speaking up and sending us stuff about, light switches and autism. And, so finally we're like, okay, let's get him tested just to prove her wrong. And when the results came back, we were shocked, like, what? Because we didn't know what does autism look like. And Scott still didn't really believe it until we went to the first pivotal response therapy appointment. And the psychologist watched Caleb for like 15 minutes and then said to Scott, okay, you see this behavior and this and this and this. These are all on the spectrum. And it's like a
Mm.
light bulb went off in Scott's mind, and then from then on, he was fully invested. But I mention this because I think a lot of families that one of the spouses doesn't have that light bulb moment, doesn't realize,
Mm.
oh, there's something different about my kid. And they just assume it's behavioral, they're non-compliant, they're just being stubborn. And while, one spouse, usually the mom, is really trying to advocate for that kid and understands their needs. And I think that leads to a lot of divorces where spouses just can't get on the same page. And, it breaks my heart because those kids really need both parents to be advocating for them. But I do find in those situations, a lot of times the parents, even though they're divorced, they still find a way to work together on behalf of their disabled kids. So sometimes they will create a special needs trust together and they'll fund it together, even though they no longer live together, have, a legal relationship, which I really respect and admire.
Oh, thanks for kind of using that, your personal story and that example. That makes so much sense though, now that you say it.
It's a journey. It's a difficult journey. When we first got Caleb's diagnosis, I feel like it was like an out-of-body experience. Or it's just like, what does this
Yeah,
mean? What does this mean for our family? Will Caleb ever have friends? Will he ever get married? What's that going to look like? And then as you go on, you realize, oh, he's still my kid. Like he's still awesome. I love him to death, but it's going to look a little bit different. His journey will be different than Isaac's journey, and that's okay.
absolutely. Yeah, and I think I don't know, maybe with the millennials kind of aging,
Hmm.
getting older
Hmm.
and having children now,
Yeah.
I think I find our generations maybe a little more open to that. Where older
Mhm.
ones, there's still a lot of shame around it, but it
Yeah,
it still obviously comes up. You know, denial is probably a piece of it.
that's right.
Well, Ellen, this conversation I've had so many takeaways from, so I know our listeners will just love you and all the work you're doing. We'll definitely include all your links and absolutely the YouTube channel for people to check out you and your work. And if they need to work with you, do you serve, the entire state of California? Do you have a location specific to only the Bay Area?
We serve all of California. We're actually a virtual firm, which has helped us grow. That could be a different podcast. How that happened. That's definitely been a transition, but we love it. There's 12 of us on our team now. And yeah, we
Wow.
serve all of California. We also have an office location in Palo Alto. So if people want to meet in person, but most of our meetings are over Zoom. We love also bringing in other professionals like you, like financial advisors, accountants, any trusted professionals. It's really important that we're all working together on this. So yeah, we do estate planning, special needs planning, trust administration. There are a lot of things we don't do just because we're still kind of a small firm. So we right now we don't do limited conservatorships. I'm hoping to bring that back into our practice at some point. We also don't help with public benefits planning. So if somebody needs to get onto SSI or appeal the decision, because most applications, like I think only 40% of SSI applications are approved, but 50% of appeals are approved. So it's really important to work with somebody to appeal. So, we can
Yes.
always provide recommendations. And then contentious stuff, if somebody's fighting, I did that for 3 long years at Morrison and Forrester. And no more. So, but for the areas that we do focus on, I feel really confident that, we love helping all sorts of families.
Yeah, we sound very similar, Ellen.
I
My
think
sense. I
so. And
Yeah.
and for people who are listening, just to let you know, we send a lot of folks to Sarah. Sarah is
Oh.
really one of our top go-tos. I love Sarah that you are, you're younger in your practice, but you have a lot of experience. And
Mhm.
you also really understand special needs families. And there's so few of you. If we could like clone you and
I know.
all over, that would be awesome.
I know we need more professional fiduciaries. Absolutely. I think
Yes,
there's
yes.
like only 900 actively licensed fiduciaries in the state. And, I really anticipate with baby boomers aging, it's just going to be really a tidal wave of need.
Yep,
So,
that's right.
anyways, well, always lovely to speak with you, Ellen. I just so appreciate your generous spirit and, your teacher's heart. And it's just been such a lovely conversation. And we'll include all your details in the show notes so listeners can find you and check out the work that you do further than this conversation. So
Awesome.
thank you again, Ellen.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.